Alternate history? It's fan fiction you write about history. There, I said it. Hello, my name is Garvin and I read things and prattle about them on the internet for your entertainment. Today we're briefly going to discuss the alternate history genre, of which The Man in the High Castle is a part of, as well as give you an idea of some of the different types and some examples of the genre. So, I'm not going to make you wait for that, let's just jump right in, right? Have you ever read a history book and started wondering, what if things went the other way? Like, what if the other side won the war or the battle? What if someone else became king or president or prime minister? Or what if a coup didn't happen? Or what if one did happen? That's the question at the heart of alternate history. What if something else happened? And then you write down what you think the consequences of that change would be. Now that change point actually has its own fancy name, by the way, called the John Bar Point or the John Bar Hinge. This is taken from the serialized novel The Legion of Time, which is actually about two possible futures fighting each other through time travel to try and pull history their way. On one side we have the utopian civilization called John Bar, and on the other side we have a more dystopian civilization called Gironchi, and both these sides are trying to shift a specific moment in time, which focuses on the rather mundane decision about to be made by a boy named John Barr. And now you see where the name comes from, right? These days, alternate history is considered a sort of subgenre of science fiction, and I run into a lot of folks who think it's a new thing, but it's honestly pretty old. For example, the oldest work I could find in my sources was by Livy, the Roman writer who was writing back in the 4th century BC. He wrote a work called Ab Urbe Condita Libre, which turns on the idea of what if Alexander the Great survived and turned his armies to conquering Europe, leading him to have to fight a war with this small, insignificant city-state known as Rome. The next big example I can find is in the 11th century AD, so there is a bit of a gap. This was written by Cardinal Peter Damon, where he discusses what if Rome was never even founded. And a lot of these early works are focused on Rome because Rome is kind of important to Western civilization. Moving forward, we do get a story in the 1490s called Tyrant Le Blanche by Jonat Martorell, which discusses the idea of a fictional knight by the name of Tyrant the White arriving in the Byzantine Empire and taking over its armies and saving it from being conquered by the Turks, which, considering the Byzantine Empire was at the time called the Roman Empire because it was the last surviving piece, we're still talking about Rome here. So you can see how much it's on everyone's mind. Fast forward to the 19th century where we see our next big batch of examples. A lot of these are French works examining what if Napoleon was never defeated? And we also have the first known English language alternate history by Nathaniel Hawthorne, a short story called P's Correspondence, in which a man who is considered insane sits down and writes his experiences of an alternate 1845, where a lot of long dead people who are famous, but in this timeline are alive and well, are happy to sit down and discuss things with him. People like Lord Byron and Napoleon, all willing to sit down with this guy and chat for a bit. But alternate history really explodes in the 20th century, with a lot of stories being written for pulp magazines, but some of these being more scholarly works. For example, in 1931, a British historian named Sir John Squire published a series of essays, mostly written by other historians, called If It Had Happened Otherwise. where essay writers examined ideas of what if history had gone differently. One of these writers was Winston Churchill, who wrote the first, what we call recursive alternate history. To kind of explain, he pretends to be a writer in a world where the Confederacy won the Civil War, writing an essay about what if Lee had lost the Battle of Gettysburg, which he did in our timeline. So he's pretending to be someone in a different timeline, making his own alternate history. So it's alternate history inside of alternate history. And those can be really fun. Man in the High Castle is an example of one of those. Today, alternate history is fairly accepted, and in some cases, heavily lauded as a fictional genre. We have television shows like The Man in the High Castle, whose first season I just finished reviewing. Movies like Resistance, which is about a Nazi invasion of the United Kingdom. Inglourious Basterds, a movie that asks what if a special forces unit made up of Jewish commandos managed to kill Hitler earlier in World War II. Or 7 Days in May, where a president during the Cold War signs a nuclear disarmament treaty with the USSR, and the country is brought to the brink of a coup because of that treaty. I am going to note, if you look into it, you're going to find a lot of English-speaking alternate histories tend to focus on very obvious points like World War II, the American Civil War, or the Cold War. And there are good reasons for this. These are periods of history where things could have gone on a dramatic swerve. Plus, everyone's at least passingly familiar with these eras, so that's less you have to explain to a casual reader. If I go and I say, here's a story where Lee wins the Battle of Gettysburg and takes Philadelphia, I don't have to explain as much. Where if I was writing for an English-speaking audience and I picked, say, one of the wars of Austrian succession, I would have to explain what the War of Austrian Succession even is to a good chunk of my audience. So you can see why most people go to those times. But moving forward, let's talk about the different types of alternate history. The standard one is often called counterfactual history, and it's just a story where history goes differently. There is an event where the outcome is different. A guy who called in sick on a specific day didn't and came to work. Someone who slipped and fell actually kept his footing, and therefore he didn't die in his bathtub, or the reverse of that. A good example is the Yiddish Policemen's Union by Michael Chabon, which supposes a world where Israel collapsed in 1948, and Jewish refugees were given sanctuary by the United States in the newly created federal district of Sita in modern-day Alaska. And I want to apologize if I mispronounced that. The story focuses on a single Jewish policeman trying to solve a murder that everyone is telling him to leave alone. And a lot of counterfactuals will often just tell you an episode in that timeline, so you don't have to take a huge scope to write these stories. A more fantastical but still popular style of alternate history is the time traveler plot, where a person or a group of people end up in the past and start changing things. The oldest example that I would consider an alternate history that I could find at least is Lest Darkness Fall by L. Sprague de Camp, where a modern American archaeologist ends up in the chaos that was Italy in 535 AD. The biggest and most popular example I can think of is Guns of the South by Harry Turtledove, where a band of neo-Nazis from South Africa travel back in time to give AK-47s to the Confederate forces in order to break apart the United States, believing that if the Confederacy survives, it will help maintain the ideology of white supremacy. And the book goes into the fallout from the Confederates having AK-47s and how much that radically changes everything. Also, I just can't seem to get away from Nazis for the past month. I've been watching Man in the High Castle, and now I'm talking about Guns of the South. Never thought that'd be an issue when I started this YouTube channel. Oh well. Sorry, I'm wool gathering. Let's keep moving. I am going to take a moment to talk about my favorite time-traveling alternate history, though, and it's the literary universe of 1632, created by Eric Flint, who sadly passed away in 2022. It starts with the idea of what if an entire West Virginia coal mining town from the year 2000 was sent back in time to 1632 Germany in the middle of the 30-year war. Now, one of the reasons I like this so much is because Eric Flynn very generously threw open the doors and not only allowed but encouraged other people to write short stories and novels set in this universe, which was a really cool thing because that meant we got all kinds of stories here. There are action adventures, there are political thrillers, romance, spy stories, straightforward political just movement stories. It's crazy. Everything set in a world where everything has been thrown up into the air. Technology, social settings, all of it is now upset because a bunch of people from the future have shown up. Now, sadly, they did decide to discontinue the universe, by which I mean they're no longer publishing new books with Eric Flynn's passing. I understand why they decided to put a stop on that, though. That said, there are still over 90 books published in this setting. So if this is something you decide to take a peek at, there's a lot of material for you to read. And I'm not going to pretend it's high literature, but a lot of it was fun. So give it a peek. I am going to have to address a quick elephant in the room, because if I don't, I know I'm going to get at least one comment asking me why I didn't list the Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court. And some of you are going to feel the answer is I'm a snob, and that's entirely possible. I don't list the Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court as alternate history because I feel it's more of a fantasy novel, so I stick it over next to the Narnia books in my head, which is a story about people going to a fantastical world and changes happening from that. That doesn't mean I don't like the story. I love Mark Twain. Don't get me wrong, it's a fun read, but A Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court isn't anchored in a specific recognizable historical period other than ye old vague medieval England, and King Arthur and the various characters he interacts with aren't really historical figures. They're figures of story, of myth. That doesn't make it bad, it just means I can't consider it alternate history because there's no real history going on here. Still a fun read. If you think I'm just being a snob, please feel free to argue with me in the comments. I look forward to hearing your thoughts. A much rarer type of alternate history is the multiverse or many worlds type of novels, where you have characters who are explicitly exploring alternate timelines, and you can even have different timelines or rival histories fighting it out across the multiverse. I haven't read a lot of these, so I'm not going to go too deep on this one. I just want you to be aware that this is a type of alternate history novel, and I've been told that Richard C. Meredith's Timeliner trilogy is a good example, or John Barnes' Timeline Wars is also a good read, but I haven't read any of these books, so I can't vouch for it myself. The nature of alternate history lends itself to being a very expansive genre that can be used as the backdrop for all kinds of story. Because you're just looking at history, picking a point, and saying, hey, what if in this point when the world zigged, it zagged instead? So you can tell romances, you can tell spy thrillers, you can tell suspense stories, true crime stories, all set in the backdrop of a history that never actually happened. That said, not to bully anyone, but I personally would be thrilled if we could focus on something other than World War II, the American Civil War, or the Cold War. I'll even give you guys some examples here. Did you know that when Commodore Perry was heading out to force Japan to open to foreign trade, the Russians were in the process of planning their own expedition with an eye of forcing Japan into becoming a protectorate and then an outright colony later on? Let's say the Russians get there first and pull that off. How much does that change history? Or look up the Taiping Rebellion in China and ask yourself, what if these guys had won and instituted a monarchy in China that was founded by a man who openly proclaimed himself to be the literal younger brother of Jesus Christ? No, I'm not making that up. That actually happened. I will include a link to that along with a book recommendation in the description. Go ahead and take a look if you're interested. Well, with that, I think this is a fine place to stop for the week. I hope you found this video informative or at least entertaining. If you did, please leave a like, a comment, or consider subscribing. All of these help me in my eternal struggle against the dread Lord algorithm. Terror be on his name. If you'd like a voice on future topics, please consider joining my Everwise patrons for $1 a month. There's another link in the description below. You can also just leave a one-time donation at my coffee, and if you do, please feel free to leave a request for something you'd like to see a video made of. Speaking of patrons, though, I'd like to give a special thanks to my biggest supporter, Big Steve. Next week, we're going back to lost mythical lands, folks. We are digging deeper into Lemuria, and I hope you'll join me, but until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and of course, keep reading.